What I've found in these questions, they come out of a test bank that was made for this textbook. And what I find is that inevitably there are a few questions that are a little bit ambiguous, or there is some small error in them, and so I allow for a slight drop in the curve, just to compensate for those little glitches that come along. And so typically, give or take, around an 85, 86 becomes an A rather than a 90, and so forth on down the line. That said, let's see, no, in my micro class, I did have one person make a 100 on their first test. I think the highest score in this section was like a 94 or something like that. So, I appreciate the fact that you appreciate that, but I think it's just an equitable thing to do. What else is on your mind? Anybody, anything? Yes, ma'am?
Can you go over a little bit about inflation?
You bet. Inflation can be described one of two ways, both of this really the same thing. Inflation is said to be a loss in the value of the dollar. We'll use American currency. Or it can be said as rising prices. Same thing. If it suddenly takes more money to buy a candy bar, then your money lost value. We typically talk about inflation, and most often we measure inflation in terms of the consumer price index. So we're measuring prices you and I as consumer would buy, or would pay, and so they pick out a market basket of goods that's supposed to represent what most consumers would purchase. So maybe in the market basket is the rental value, the rental cost for a 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment. Maybe there's in there the price of 1 pound of ground beef, the price of 1 gallon of gasoline, the price of 1 gallon of milk. And so they build this composite basket, and then they literally have people, I had a student one year who was one, who go to grocery stores around town on a regular basis, and they record the prices of those things. And so the Department of Commerce is constantly collecting all this information and observing how prices are doing in the economy. And from that, they construct their consumer price index. But if you go further back up the chain of distribution, you can go to the producer price index. And this is going to talk about what are the producers paying to buy raw materials. Prices of steel or aluminum or rubber or whatever. And then further down the chain, then going towards the retail stores, there's a wholesale price index. What are the wholesalers paying to the producers? And how is that inflation? Of course, if this starts going up, what do we know is going to happen? It's going to go up down here, and then it's going to go up down here. But we tend to tie a lot of our policy to the consumer price index. And when you look at it, if I saw that the consumer price index went up 6% last year, and I was going to go into my boss and talk about my, possible pay raise for next year, that'd be my starting point. Boss, if you give me 6% more, you haven't made me any better off. You've just kept me even with the cost of living. In many situations, you may have a compensation package that provides a COLA. That's a cost of living allowance. And many times that will be tied to the consumer price index, and you'll get a COLA every year based on how much inflation goes up. If you were an elderly person drawing Social Security, your Social Security payment goes up a little bit every year based pretty much on what happens to consumer price indexes. So the CPI is the one we watch the most often. We've got to remember a couple of things. If the CPI has steak in there that they're measuring the price of, and the price of steak goes up, what do you and I do? We buy chicken. Suddenly barbecued chicken takes on a whole new appeal. And so we tend to substitute away from this. And to the extent that people substitute away from the products in the market basket, this is a little bit of an overstatement because they're trying to keep their prices down. For a long time, they had the cost of a new home as part of the market basket. Well, think about that. How many people go out and buy a new home every year? None. Very few. So that was a real overstatement of costs. And so they started instead counting rental costs. And so they're constantly playing with it. trying to make it a more accurate reflection of what's going on in the economy. As they do this, for our purposes, we'll see that when the consumer, this is very similar, by the way, to the GDP deflator. We used that earlier, talking about deflating GDP. We use the consumer price index the same way. If you see that in 2012, the CPI was 100, what does that tell you? Anytime you see that the CPI is 100, we know that is immediately, by definition, the base year. That's the year we're going to compare everything else to. It doesn't matter what year you choose. If you went back to 2011, you might find that the CPI was in fact 94. And in 2010, it was maybe 91. And what is that telling you, Lucy? It says whatever you paid $1 for in 2012, prior to that you were paying 94 cents or 91 cents. And so as inflation goes up in future years, the CPI also climbs. So what used to cost $1 that year cost $1.07 the next year. Okay, that's our rough appreciation then of how our price is doing, to which we immediately stop and say, well, how's my income doing? How much of a pay raise am I getting? Am I keeping up on average? First question. You will see questions along this line. So this is a sample problem. If the CPI in 2012 was 104, and the CPI in 2013 was 109, how much inflation occurred in 2013? What was the rate of inflation in 2013? And it's not 5%. That's the change in the consumer price index.
Wouldn't it be like 109 minus 104 divided by 104?
Yes, it's the change divided by the first year. In this case, the change was 5%, and the index in the first year was 104. So what is 5 divided by 104? Anybody got that? Please?
0.048.
4.48?
Yeah.
So the rate of inflation was really about 4.8% between those 2 years. And you want to, I don't know whether you'll wind up with one of these on an exam, but suppose that the next year, 2014, it goes up to 117. What's the rate of inflation there? It's the change divided by the first year, 109. You okay with that? So that's how we're looking at the rate of inflation every year. Ideally, we would love to, as a target, we'd like to keep the rate of inflation somewhere around 1 to 2% per year. We want to allow a little inflation in the system. This allows prices to go up and wages maybe not to go quite as much up, and so you get a little bit of downward pressure on wages, which can be helpful to the economy. The rate of inflation recently has been closer to 1%. That's been very comfortable in a sense that if you were making a little more money, it was, probably getting ahead of inflation somewhat. If you go to the period between let's go to the year. In 1979, the rate of inflation was 12%. What would 12% inflation do to you? I mean, every year, the cost of living goes up 12%. That is a real hammer, especially if your income only went up 2%. What happened then? If your inflation is there, but your income goes up 2%, how did you do? How far down are you?
10%.
You lost 10%. You lost 10% in your standard of living, or the way we would probably more commonly say it, you had a 10% drop in your real income. Real means what?
Current.
After inflation. Real means after removing the effects of inflation. Your real income dropped 10%. Or we might say your purchasing power, same thing. Your purchasing power dropped 10%. Now, how many years you got to suffer a 10% drop in your purchasing power before your lifestyle is severely compromised? You know? It's the same idea as there's not inflation, but I take away your income. I cut it by 10% every year. Things get pretty rough. So 1979, this huge rate of inflation, we're going to take a lot closer look at what caused that and how our policymakers treated it. To me, it's kind of interesting. I began teaching at Santa Fe in 1980, right in the middle of that. And since I've started teaching here, beginning about 1984, inflation hasn't been a real worry. And so I find myself teaching about inflation and high rates of inflation and what it'll do to you. And you're just about the third generation of students I got, and you're sitting there saying, so what? What you're talking about has no relevance to my life. I've never seen that. My mom and dad never saw that. 12% inflation? It's stupid, ridiculous. But we did have it. If you look back to Germany following World War I, they had rates of inflation 500%. In post-World War I Europe, Germany in particular, they saw prices going up so quickly, it was commonplace in the stores, before you open your store in the morning, you marked all your prices up. You closed your store for lunch, and while you closed your store, you went back and marked your prices up again. That's how fast prices were rising, which meant that if you were carrying paper money, every hour of the day, it would buy less and less and less and less. And the story, the typical picture is a wheelbarrow full of paper money would buy one loaf of bread. That in fact, that wheelbarrow full of paper money in the winter had more value if you simply burned the currency because the money wasn't worth anything. That's how bad inflation can get. And that's usually because of very stupid governmental policies. So what causes inflation? We generally talk about two types. Two types of inflation. First we call demand pull. And to do this, we sort of introduce the beginning of the graph we're going to use so often in this course from now on out. It's an aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. You'll see a lot of that on the third exam. But it says basically this. You remember the supply and demand stuff you saw for the first test? Up here, instead of price, we're going to put the price level, whatever the consumer price level is, for example. And down here, we're going to put real GDP, the true amount of stuff we're producing. And from that, we're going to have a demand curve. We're going to call it the aggregate demand curve. Aggregate means everything totaled up together. And we're going to measure aggregate demand. That's our GDP. Consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. That's the equation you remember for the rest of your life about macroeconomics. Aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus X. And we'll kind of hammer on that a little bit. That's the total spending in the economy, but look what it's saying. It's saying when prices fall, we spend more money. We produce and buy more stuff. That's just a regular demand curve. And then added to that is an aggregate supply curve, sort of like this for now. And that says, what do producers do? Suppliers. Well, when prices go up, they produce more. And we're back to regular old supply and demand right out of chapter 3. And it says, well, here's where the economy is today. And this corresponds to some consumer price level. Let's call it 102, whatever. And some level of GDP, let's call it 106 trillion, I don't know. Trillion, bazillion, gazillion, pick a number, zeros are zeros, okay? And it says, here's where we are today. And then from this picture, we start our analysis. And we say, well, what would happen if we gave consumers a huge tax cut? What would you do if your taxes were cut by 50%? What would you do with your money? Spend like crazy, right? And anytime spending increases, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. Anytime business investment spending increases, the demand curve shifts to the right. Anytime government spends more money building airplanes, building schools, aggregate demand increases, shifts to the right. Anytime we enjoy selling more exports to our trading partners, aggregate demand shifts to the right. But look what happens. If you get the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right, on one hand, that's really good news. We're now producing more goods and services, and in order to do that, we've created more jobs. Hallelujah. That's the good news. The bad news is prices have risen. Maybe the CPI has gone up to 108. So, aggregate demand increases. Good thing or bad thing? Yes. Answer is yes. Good in the sense we got more jobs and more toys to buy. Bad in the sense that prices went up. Okay, so far? Look at this quick graph over here by contrast. What if the aggregate supply curve looked like this? Kind of steep. And you had an increase in aggregate demand from here to here. AD1 to AD2. Better off or worse off? For the economy. The economy is better off in the sense that we are producing a little bit more stuff, right? We have more jobs. But we're worse off in the sense that prices went up a hell of a lot. So in this case, the aggregate demand increase probably had more bad news than it did good news. You see that? Okay? But look what's happening. Anytime aggregate demand increases, it pulls up prices. It's like you're running a store, you're running a shoe store, you opened at 8 o'clock this morning, and by 10:30 you sold out all your shoes because people are buying like drunk sailors. What are you going to do tomorrow? You hope you get some new shoes in to put on the shelves for tomorrow morning, and what are you going to do tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock when your store opens? You're going to sell them at the same price. If you're going to sell them at the same price, you probably shouldn't study and major in business because you don't understand how money works. When people are buying every damn thing you can sell, raise the price. Okay? So, because people are buying like crazy, we start raising prices. And in fact, when we call back our supplier and say, hey, I need some more shoes, what's he hearing from all the shoe stores? Everybody needs more shoes. So he's got to buy more leather. He's got to maybe start a second shift making shoes. His costs are going up. He's going to raise prices to you anyway. So you're going to raise prices to your customers. So it's this increase in aggregate demand, an increase in spending that's pulling prices up. That's why we call it demand pull inflation, caused by more spending. Okay, so far? That's the first set. You're going to see a lot more of that, but don't get too wrapped around the axle just yet. The other kind of inflation is called cost push. Same graph. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand, equilibrium. CPI 102, 16 trillion, whatever. Instead of people out there spending more money, imagine this. Imagine that you're running a trucking company, okay? You got a trucking company, you got 200 trucks and drivers, and you're shipping stuff for people all over the country. You're doing good. And tomorrow, the cost of diesel and gasoline goes up by 50%. What's that going to do to your business?
It's not going to make as much money. Your
costs are going up, and if you don't raise your prices, your profits are going down. So what are you going to do? I'm going to raise my prices. So when businesses, producers, sellers experience a rise in costs, they pass those along in higher prices, and we show that by a decrease in the supply curve. That means that before, sellers produced 16 trillion stuff at this price, but now to produce that much, they want a higher price. To produce this much, they want a higher price. All this means is prices are rising because costs have risen and producers are passing it along to me and you. This is what happened in 1973 with the OPEC oil embargo, which we will return to later in the course. Basically, oil prices overnight quadrupled. And that's when we had the terrible fuel shortage, gas stations running out of gas, long lines. It was a catastrophe. And it took us many years to get through that, but it's that 1973 OPEC embargo that triggered a successive series of price increases and brought us eventually to that 12% inflation by 79. So cost push, sellers' costs go up. They pass them along. Demand pull, buyers spend more. Now, the buyers may be consumers, or it may be government, or it may be businesses buying computers and trucks and office buildings. Okay? Any of these increases in spending, any of these increases in costs is going to create inflation. Well, what's the bad news? Look at the graph. What's the bad news about cost push inflation? Exactly. Not only did prices go up, but you produced less stuff. That's the worst possible scenario. You have inflation. At the same time, you have what we're going to call recession, a shrinking economy. When you have a recession, for recession, think the word unemployment. When you have a recession and you have inflation at the same time, we didn't really think that was possible until the 70s. But when you get them together, we call it stagflation. A stagnant, recessed economy experiencing inflation. And we're going to make a big deal out of that on the fourth exam in this course. But you see generally where we're going. How are we doing so far? You asked for inflation. You're getting kind of the cook's tour here. Okay? And I'm sure you're right, and I'll erase the board. Yes, sir?
Well, just while we're on inflation,
Sure.
Could you cover the adjustable mortgage rate and just,
Oh, yeah.
how that affects us?
I'll tell you that as a story. No problem. What does inflation do to our lives? Well, we've already seen that for me and you, rising prices like that, if your income doesn't keep up, you're screwed. But imagine for a moment instead you're a bank. Imagine that you loan me money at 2% interest and inflation went up to 8%. You're making 2% on your money, but it's losing 8% every year. How are you doing? You're losing 6% per year. You see that? That's what inflation did to banks and lending institutions in the 70s. They had lent out lots and lots of money at a fixed rate. Here's your mortgage for your house. The typical mortgage was a 30-year loan at a fixed rate for 30 years. My dad moved to Gainesville in 1966 when he retired from the military, and he bought a house. 4-bedroom, 3-bath, fireplace, 2-car garage, swimming pool, nice. $26,000 in 1966. That's what it cost him. Which sounds kind of ridiculous right now, except you got to remember that back then he was making about $8,000 a year. No problem. Turns out his mortgage payment for this house was $126 a month, which again sounds ludicrous today, but back then that was kind of the norm. Dad went to work for the VA, and eventually transferred to Michigan, transferred to North Carolina, and got a job back here in Gainesville. And he had kept his house, rented it out, and was paying on the mortgage. He comes back to Gainesville in 1979. Remember that? High rates of inflation. Instead of making $8,000 a year, by now he's making about, I don't know, 30, which was pretty damn good money. What do you suppose his mortgage payment was? $126 a month. He was loving life. Every month when he would write the mortgage payment, he would just be in a good mood for 2 or 3 days. And I knew if I needed to hit him up for something, that was the time to find him. In the meantime, though, the mortgage company was dying because they loaned him all this money. He still owed them something like $5,000. And they were getting their crummy $126 a month payment when interest rates and mortgage rates by then were up around 12 and 14%. His was down around 4%. And so what would happen is they would call him about every 90 days. And they'd call him up and say, hey, Strick, you know, you still owe us $5,000 on that mortgage, but if you'd like to make a deal, we'll let you pay it off for $4,200. How about that? And he'd listen to him and say, well, how about if I gave you $1,800 instead? Oh, we can't do that. We can't do that. Okay, call me when you can. Have a nice day. Click. And he just giggled. He thought that was so cool. And this went on for years. And finally, you know, he paid the damn thing off for something around that. It was nothing. They needed to get their money back to be able to lend it out at the much higher rates. That's when banks went to adjustable rate mortgages. And that's when they would say, your mortgage rate is the prime rate, and we'll talk about what that is, plus 4%. Maybe something like that. The prime rate, and there's some definitions on interest rates we'll play with some more later. The prime rate of interest, that's the rate of interest that Bill Gates would pay if he borrowed money from Wells Fargo, big bank. That's the rate that the very richest people pay for borrowing money because they're no risk. This is sort of the no risk rate. Okay so far? What do you suppose, if prime is, let's say prime is 4%. If prime is 4%, how much are you and I going to pay when we want to borrow money? We're going to pay more than that. We're going to pay a premium of maybe 4, or depending on your credit record, maybe 12. And so then they began to write mortgages on the same basis. So that what happens? When inflation goes up, interest rates go up, and your mortgage payment goes up. That's where the adjustable rate mortgage was the bank's way to protect themselves from inflation. Okay? They still use them, they still write them. Not terribly critical these days with the very low rates of inflation.
Did the housing market crash in 2008, did that affect like the way mortgages are written at all, or did that not so much affect the rates, but...
It didn't affect the rates so much. What you had is they wrote mortgages to people who shouldn't have ever qualified. Because they knew that those people were buying that house and selling it 30 days, 60 days, 90 days later. And so they didn't care if you could afford the payment because they knew you were going to sell the house and then give you the mortgage. And you'd buy a $100,000 house, 90 days later you'd sell it for $150,000, you made $50,000, less some small charges. You were happy, they loaned it to the next person who couldn't afford it either because they knew they were going to buy it too. And that's how the banks got out of control, allowing all that credit to go out there and inflate prices on houses so high they eventually fell. Okay? There's two ways to go out and put money into an investment, okay? Let's get terminology here for a second. An investment means that the value of what you buy is going to rise. Typically, a home prices, home values are going to go up 2 or 3% per year on average. And so if you buy your home for that reason, that's part of your investment, that's fine. But the other thing that goes on there is called speculation. Speculation is when you buy something based on the theory of the greater fool. You remember reading about that anywhere, anybody? Anybody read about that? This is what drove the stock market rise and crash in 1929. That's when you buy something at any price, you'll pay anything for it because you think there's a bigger fool than you who will pay an even higher price. And when you're buying stock, not because you think the company's valuable, but because you think other people will pay even more for it, that's called speculation. That's what triggered the 2008 crisis. People were buying homes not because of their value, but because of speculative investment. Eventually the prices get high enough that people stop and they say, well, damn, that's just too high. That's just ridiculous. I don't think there is anybody else going to pay more than that for it. And then what happens? You bought yourself a $280,000 house. It's got a $3,000 a month mortgage payment. And you figured you were going to sell it for about $330,000, right? What happens? Nobody buys it. And you're sitting there paying $3,000 a month on it. What are you thinking? Oh, damn. Well, what's your next move? You start dropping the price on your house. And the next thing you know, the $280,000 house you bought, you have to sell it for $240,000. You lost $40,000. And that's what happened to stocks in 1929, houses in 2008 and 2009, because they were speculated up above their true value. That moment when the market goes, oh damn, those prices are too high, don't buy anymore, and prices start to fall. That moment, called the oh damn moment, is kind of interesting to look at. We'll return to that. All right, one last note on inflation. It's called the rule of 72. It's just the number 72. It's not $72. It's not an index. It's not a year. It's just the 72 number works. If you take the rate of inflation and you divide that number into 72, that will give you the number of years it takes for prices to double. This is a compound interest phenomenon that the number 72 just happens to work pretty accurately over most ranges of time. If you have 8% inflation, it'll take 9 years for prices to double. At today's rate of 2%, it'll take 36 years for prices to double. At the 12% rate in 1979, prices would double every 6 years. The rule of 72. You okay with that? Let's twist it just a little bit. Suppose inflation is at 12%. Your income is going up at 9%. What's the rate of growth in your real income? -3. That's your rate of growth. If you take that negative rate of growth, divide it into 72, that's 3 into 72, what is that? 24. In 24 years, your income will not double, it will be cut in half because it's a negative rate of growth. So the rule of 72 applies to growth or to shrinkage, if you will. Okay? All right, anything else? Sir?
The article on the decline of spatial economics.
The decline of spatial economics, yes, sir.
I read it, but I couldn't exactly get a grasp of what spatial economic was. But it's sort of like all the benefits it would do. Like it would get more people to buy suburbanized houses and
Yeah, spatial economics refers to the fact that how important is the distance between where something is manufactured and where it is consumed. If there is more space to be covered, what happens to the economics of that activity? And typically, if we manufacture everything in a big city and we have to send it out to the small towns everywhere, then the length of that travel route is important. And if you live out in the boondocks, things cost more because it costs more money to ship them out there. So that's spatial economics. But what has happened with technology, with 3D printing as an example, but with computers as inventory management tools, we have reduced the costs of all that travel. And in fact, with 3D printers, I can have a printer out here in this little store out in, West Bulrush nowhere, and you call me up and say, hey, I need a hammer. I don't have to call in and have it shipped. I simply print it up for you. I print you a 3D hammer. What happened to the cost of making you the hammer? It's much, much reduced. I don't have to ship it. I don't have to inventory it. I don't have to store it. And so the argument behind the paper was that given this decline of the importance of spatial economics and transportation, et cetera, that more and more people are going to be moving out of the cities and into the suburbs, et cetera, because it's going to be cheaper to live out there. Is that clear enough? Okay, good. Which is just in contrast to everything we've been reading for the last 20 years, that more and more young people are preferring to move into the cities, live in apartments, don't even need to buy a car. More and more people not even getting driver's licenses anymore because they're very happy living in the congested cities because there's so much to do, it's so convenient, and it's cheaper that way. And this says, well, maybe there's another trend at work. Okay, other questions? It's a lot of damn talking for one morning for me. Yes, sir.
So about the redistributive effects of like price, income, and wealth.
And there was an inflation chapter, I'm saying.
Give me a little more detail. Redistributive effect of?
Like the title of the paragraph is like redistributive effects of income, and then like they usually talk about price, like income and wealth. Yeah, I think it's like nominal, like income and real income, and then talks about differences like that. I was looking confused reading all that section.
I'm trying to remember what he had in there about that. And I'm drawing a blank. What page, you got a page number or anything like that?
That's the redistributive effects of inflation.
The redistributive effects of
There
inflation.
you go, I said it wrong.
Okay, good. What happens with inflation? If you are loaning money, you're losing. Because rates are going up, but you're still making that same fixed rate of interest. If you are borrowing money, you're doing good. My dad. Okay? So in that sense, inflation redistributed money away from lenders towards borrowers. Likewise, if I told you that inflation starting tomorrow was going to go up to 20% a year, what would you do to prepare?
Save.
Well, if the money you saved is going to buy less and less.
Try to get a loan now.
Borrow money right now on a fixed rate, and what would you do with that money?
Save.
No, don't save money, because inflation destroys the value of your money. Huh?
Loan it out tomorrow.
Loan it out, or better yet, go buy a house. Go buy a nice collector's artwork. Go buy an antique car. Go buy precious metals or gold coins. Go buy things whose value goes up with inflation. It's called an inflationary hedge. Gold is typically an inflationary hedge. Real estate has been a wonderful inflationary hedge. Okay? That when inflation set in, real estate values went up. Okay? And you do that by borrowing money at the fixed rate, put the money into an inflationary hedge, watch it go up in price, and when the inflation finally slows down, then you sell that off as high a price as you can. And you win. That way, the redistributive effect went towards you and away from the people who are out there having to buy a house at that inflated price. So I think that's generally what he's talking about. Okay, what else? Yes, ma'am?
I had a question. There was these formulas, there was 3 formulas, but One of them was like, I think it's like multiply by 100, and it didn't do. So real GDP is the nominal GDP divided into the GDP deflector.
Divided by.
blended. Yeah, divided by, and then times 100. I kept getting
Yeah.
that wrong. I don't. And
Here's what they're saying. You can use it for GDP or anything else. Real GDP is nominal GDP divided by the GDP deflator. And now, what I did, I put a little star there. But what they're doing, this is their terminology, divided by 100. Let's see what that means, okay? Don't let that confuse you. That's everything we've done before. It's just the way they give you the numbers.
yeah, on the textbook, it's like if you would do the division and then multiply by 100. That's why I kept all like, well, the formula's right here.
Nominal.
Yeah, and then you have to multiply by 100, and that's
Well,
what I kept doing. And I was
Here's
wrong.
what happens. If you've got, let's say, 116 here, no, I'm sorry, you don't even know what the real is. You've got, calculate the real because the nominal GDP is 126 and the GDP deflator is 112. Because they always give it to you as 100 and something. What did I tell you we do with that GDP deflator? We move the decimal point over 2 places. That's the same thing as dividing by 100. That's the only change. That's why, to me, this is a little bit confusing.
Yeah, I was doing the division first and then multiplying. I was like, this is totally wrong.
Yeah. Just, that's why I ignore that. Every time I look at a deflator, I go right here and I say, oh, $1.12.
Thank you.
Good. I'm glad you asked that because I think a lot of people were a little confused with it. Okay, sir.
Chapter 6, the unemployment rate
Mhm.
formula. It's the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force.
Right.
But in some instances, people that are seeking a job are still a part of the labor force, but they're not employed. How do you find a number?
Okay, the labor force is composed of 2 parts. Those who have a job and those who are looking for a job. And they have to be 16 years of age or older. Okay? This is the thing you want to retain as you look at some of these questions, is that anybody who's not looking doesn't count. They're not in the labor force.
So that would be the number up top, is the people not looking for a job.
Well, let's say that we had 1,000 people have a job and 200 people are looking for a job. And so 200 of them are unemployed.
Okay.
Then what do we got? We got 2 over 1,200. We got a 2 over 12, which is a 16%, 17% unemployment rate.
So would the unemployed be the people looking for a job and the people that are not looking? Or,
If you're not looking, you're not part of the labor force. That's the key.
right, but what about the number up top?
That's going to be, how many of you don't have jobs? Well, maybe there's 800 people raise their hand. And you say, okay, of those 800 who don't have jobs, how many of you are looking for a job? And a bunch of hands go down. Well, they're not counted as unemployed. Only the ones that are looking.
Okay.
There was a time, about the time I got out of the service, when if you were on unemployment, you had to go down every 2 weeks and pick up your check. And they would ask you, do you have a job? No. Have you turned down a job? No. Are you looking for a job? Yes. Here's your check. It was just the same criteria, you know. And then they started saying, okay, if you're going to get your unemployment check, you have to go around and apply for at least 2 jobs every 2 weeks. And you have to bring back documentation showing that you applied for the job, because they wanted to make sure you were looking. But the big key there is what we call discouraged workers. Discouraged workers. Those are the people who have given up hope and aren't looking for a job anymore. They're not part of the unemployment rate.
Isn't that the workers that are not actively seeking but would work if like one was offered?
we think they would.
I read
Yeah, we think they
exact
would work.
definition. It's like an individual who isn't actively seeking employment but would look for or accept a job if one were available. That's like,
Yeah.
it's contradicting. I don't know.
In a sense.
Yeah.
To me, it's people who have basically given up hope and are not looking. They're employable, and they might take a job if they found it, but they're not even looking. Which means what? If you have a lot of discouraged workers, what does that mean? If they say, well, the unemployment rate is 5%, but you've got a bunch of people over here, what does that tell you? This is probably more like 8% or 10%,
Yeah, because they aren't counted.
because they aren't counted, but they'd still like to have a job.
That doesn't make sense though. Like,
So
okay, so if you're not even looking, you're never gonna find a job. But
Yeah.
you would work if there were jobs.
Yeah,
But if you're not
if some
looking, how are you gonna know if there are
Little,
jobs
you
or
know,
not? Like,
angel came down and touched you on the shoulder and said, hey, I got you a job, you know?
makes no sense.
So technically speaking, the discouraged workers would not be a part of the labor force?
That's correct, because they're not looking, they're not searching.
Okay.
Now tell me this, if I told you the unemployment rate is 5%, what would the conservatives say about that? And what would the liberals say about that?
Conservatives would probably say it's kind of a healthy percentage because inflation's going to be lower.
No, inflation could be high or not high.
Isn't there like a percentage of unemployment that is like healthy for the economy though?
Well, it's not necessarily healthy, but it's always there. And that's that natural rate we talked about in class, the structural and the frictional unemployment. But the attitude of the conservative typically is there's a bunch of deadbeats out there drawing unemployment who'd work if they had to. And so the unemployment rate to the conservative is closer to 3%. Okay? And the liberal looks out there and says all those poor people who would love to get a job if they could, they're not even being counted, and the real rate is probably closer to 9%. You see that? The liberal looks at that and says, that's too low. It's worse than that. The conservative says, that's too high. Those people need to get off their ass and go to work. You see the two different views? That's why this number itself is not particularly meaningful to us. What is meaningful to us is how does that number change over time? Is it going up or is it going down? Okay? Mean people, suckers, okay?
So are discouraged workers the same as the phantom unemployed?
I've got to remember how he is defining phantom unemployed, because there's a couple of different working
I have
definitions.
it as people who report that they're actively seeking a job and they have little interest in actually finding one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, because those people don't want to do anything.
No, but they say they're looking, and therefore they're counted as part of the workforce. And this is what the conservative is talking about.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, he's talking about the fact there's a lot of phantom unemployment out there, of people who are claiming unemployment, claiming to be looking, but the fact is they're not. They won't get off their butts. Yeah.
Got a like off-topic question about
That's allowed.
unemployment. There was this like talk, I don't even know if it was ever a thing that people on unemployment should be drug tested.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know, like, if as a liberal and a conservative, how would that argument be presented to out of vote?
And I don't know the status on the law now in Florida or anywhere else, but at one point they wanted you to be drug tested in order to get food stamps or other welfare or unemployment. And the argument was, we shouldn't be giving away our tax dollars to a bunch of dopers. Who do you suppose said that? The conservatives. And so they said, therefore, we're going to drug test everybody, which became a fascinating experience. When they started drug testing them, they found very, very, very few failed the drug test. But the cost of the drug test to test everybody was exorbitant. So drug testing to me is almost like voter ID. How much voter fraud is there out there in the election process? Almost none. So why are we making people go through all these hoops for all these identifications when it's not really a problem? Well, the answer to that's pretty obvious too, because we want to keep some people from voting. We want to make it difficult for them to vote. So you get these good sounding, noble ideas. We don't want to be giving our money away to dopers. Oh, yeah, let's test them all. Well, sure, why don't we put them all, put a whip on them too, just make sure they're telling the truth.
The liberal side of it would be that's a violation of privacy, wouldn't it? Like,
Well,
I
yes
mean,
and
that's what
no.
I
I mean,
say, like,
yeah,
the
they could
spectrum of
argue
the
part of
setting,
that, yeah. They could argue, why are you discriminating against these people? When they're doing the same thing on the voter ID.
We also don't know if it's a problem until we truly test it out.
True, we can run the test for a year and see, how high is the incidence. But so far from what I've seen in the voter ID and the research they've done, there's no real voter problem out there, and certainly not one that justifies the expense of all this identification and checking. So, we'll see. You've got to distinguish between the espoused reason we're going to do this versus what are the effects of doing this, and then see who benefits from those effects.
right.
There. All right, what else? That's a lot of stuff. I'm glad to see at least some of you are working through this stuff, reading it carefully, and either are highlighting it or bought a used book, I'm not sure which, but
No, this is mine.
Zach?
On the homework, there was something where it said like, when there's a lot of people that just stop spending, it asked for which employment it was, and it's like seasonal, frictional, structural, or cyclical.
Cyclical.
And that was the answer, but I don't know why. And I think
See if I can find the best way to
like
explain.
when I remember it's in demand is when there's too much demand, not enough supply. So that
Look at this. Let's talk about what we traditionally have called the business cycle. Hence the term cyclical unemployment, okay? That over time, our GDP, which means our spending, tends to do this. This is, let's say, 1900 to 2015, I don't know. It tends to go up and down, and not on a regular basis. There's the Great Depression. There's 2008, whatever. When the economy turns down, we spend less, and therefore people lose jobs. This is what we're going to call a recession. Another term for that sometimes in the cycle, they say this is the contractionary phase of the business cycle. What caused it? Oh, any number of reasons. Ask an economist, he'll give you 7 reasons right off the top of his head, okay? When you get to the bottom of it, this is called the trough, or the low point. Trough meaning the very bottom. When you start coming back out of it, spending is increasing, and we call that the growth phase, or sometimes we call it the recovery phase. And then when we get up here just before it turns down, we call that the peak. Now, the unemployment that occurs from the business cycle turning down is that cyclical unemployment they're talking about. When people just stop spending for cyclical reasons, you lost your job. Yeah. But we're going to use the word recession frequently from now on in terms of a period of growing unemployment, loss of jobs, and associated with that, all the social upset that goes with it. I wish I had a good video of the Great Depression. The Great Depression. Did I give you a reading on that yet? I don't remember if I assigned it. Well, we're talking on cycles. Just in the 1920s in the United States, what was life like?
Fantastic.
What did we call it?
The Roaring
The
Twenties.
Roaring Twenties. Now, from an economic perspective, it was pretty neat because technology was booming. What sort of new technologies were coming along? Affordable cars, radios, Anything else?
Cities were becoming skyscrapers.
Cities, skyscrapers, construction. We even had the talkies. What were the talkies? Moving pictures that had sound. Not color yet, but sound. Fascinating, okay? And if you went to one of the silent movies, what sound was there?
Piano.
There was a guy playing the piano down in the front. My dad used to tell me about going to the movies like that back in the 20s, okay? But in the 20s, things are booming. People are getting telephones in their homes. They're connecting with each other. Everybody's getting able to afford automobiles, and it's really a great time, particularly in the cities. In the farm areas and the rural areas, not so good. But we didn't notice that too much. What else was going on in the 20s? Big social experiment we tried in the United States. Prohibition. You cannot manufacture, buy, or sell anything with alcohol in it. Why? Because too many people were getting drunk and it was ruining families. So we'll just pass a law against it. That'll fix it, right? How did we respond to prohibition?
Black market.
We made bootleg liquor, which meant you had an artificial leg and you filled it up with liquor and you wore that, and that's how you transported your liquor. We had moonshine, right? Make it out in the country and then haul it into the cities. The Kennedy family, President Kennedy and his father in particular, Joe Kennedy, he got filthy rich importing liquor from Canada illegally, okay? We had the speakeasies where if you knew the right knock, they'd open it up and you can come in and you buy all the booze you wanted. Prohibition was a running joke. It was an experiment in trying to outlaw something that people were going to do anyway. But this was, again, part of the culture of the 30s in particular, but beginning in the 20s. The other thing that's going on then with all this technology, there is social change and there is economic growth. And sometimes in this course, we talk about economic growth and we forget about the social changes that were going on too. Economically, companies are forming, they're manufacturing all these wonderful products, they're making huge profits. Life is good. I mean, just because cars are popular, guess what else? You got people making tires and making steering wheels and making batteries. You got people paving roads. You got people building gas stations. This new thing comes along called a motel, okay? And this huge boom. And now people are mobile. And now they start moving out of the cities because they can commute into work and go back home where it's nice and quiet. So you have this social change going on too, where given this freedom and given the media, we should always remember the media as an agent of social change and what's going on. What are we seeing in the movies? We're seeing women by God, with dresses up to their knees and higher. I mean higher. Just horribly offensive. Dancing in public, I'm telling you, okay? Not even that. Playing cards, that's the devil's workshop. They're out there playing cards.
Smoking.
And worst of all, smoking in public. No sense of decorum, no sense of shame. I mean, you prayed that your son wouldn't bring one of those Uzis home, right? Social change is underway, and we're beginning to redefine what kind of jobs women can do. We actually went so far as we gave them the right to vote. Well, that's when the train went off the track, isn't it? Okay? This social change that's going on seems very positive in most aspects. The economic growth is very positive, higher standards of living. Economic growth, by the way, also translates into the stock market. Because these companies sell their stock in order to raise more money to build more factories, and people start realizing that the stock market is a good way to invest your money. And the stock market at this time is operating on this particular principle called margin buying. To buy stock on margin means that you go to your stockbroker, me, and you say, Strick, I want to buy $100 worth of stock. I've scraped together $100 worth of savings here, and I want to put it in the market because stock prices are going up. And I say, no problem. If you give me $100, I can legally loan you $900 more. You only have to put down 10% of the price of the stock you want to buy. So margins at 10%. You give me $100, I loan you $900. You now own $1,000 worth of stock. How does that make you feel?
Pretty darn good.
Pretty good, particularly since things are booming. Remember, the recovery phase, the boom, prices are going up. And let's say, make it easy, 6 months from now, you got $2,000 worth of stock. Your stock price has gone up to $2,000. Now how you feeling? Damn fine. What do you want to do with that $2,000?
Buy more stock.
You immediately said, you give me back my $900. You give mama back the $100 you stole out of her purse, right? What do you got left? You got $1,000. You with me so far? What do you want to do with that $1,000? Invest it. How much stock can you buy? $10,000 worth of stock. You come to good old Snappy Strickland, he's owns you $9,000, you got $10,000 in stock, it doubles in price, and you are a freaking genius, aren't you? Because what? You pay me back my 9, you pay yourself back your 1, you still got $10,000 in profit. What do you want to do with that? If you invest it, how much stock can you buy? $100,000. And this is what's going on. Now, why are people buying this stock? As an investment or as speculation? Speculation. Okay.
Like those darn tulips.
Just like those tulips back in Holland. They had a tulip mania there at one time, and tulip prices went sky high and then collapsed. Well, this goes along until what we call the Minsky moment occurs. This is what I was talking about earlier. Name for a guy named Hyman Minsky. The Minsky moment is that point at which the market goes, oh damn, these prices are too high. I don't think I want to buy anymore. Matter of fact, I think I'll start selling off what I got. And when the smart money starts selling off, prices fall. And when the pretty smart money says, we're going to sell too, prices fall faster. And when the really not real smart money sells too, prices go through the roof and the market is collapsed. But what do you suppose that does to consumer spending? Remember that, CIG and X? What happens to consumer spending? It's gone. And consumer spending is, give or take, 70% of the economy. And now we have the Great Depression. And it gets complicated by a few other factors we'll look at maybe later, but that's that downturn in the cycle with that huge cyclical unemployment. By 1933, unemployment is 25%. If the natural rate was 5%, you've got a 20% cyclical unemployment rate. Your country's devastated. When did this occur? Again, some knowledge of political history. In 1928, we elected a Republican president named Herbert Hoover. In 1929, the market collapses. And in 1932, Hoover's up for re-election, and the economy's a disaster. Who did we elect instead?
FDR.
Franklin Roosevelt. And when we start looking at the things he did, how do you deal with an economy where 25% of the people are unemployed? And remember the societal picture too. It's not like most families had a husband and a wife working. Most families had one income earner, the husband, and 25% of them don't have jobs. That would be today's equivalent, probably of 40-45% unemployment. How do you fix that? How do you or I personally survive? And then how do we as a society or as a government, how do we fix that? And that's what this course is about. How do you deal with those kinds of huge macroeconomic problems? You know what Roosevelt did, broadly speaking, anybody?
Social Security.
He created the New Deal. What else?
Social Security.
He implemented a number of programs, one of which was Social Security, one of which was a Works Progress Administration. Anybody here ever heard of the Triple C?
Yeah.
Civilian Conservation Corps? That was an interesting system. He said, we have all these young men unemployed in our country who would like to have jobs, so they took military cadre. They take maybe 2 or 3 guys, they give them a truck or 2, loaded up with tents and stoves and sleeping bags and uniforms and boots, and maybe in Stark. They drive into Stark and they put up notices on the telephone poles and the walls and say, Triple C's having a meeting Sunday at 1 o'clock. Any young men looking for employment, please show up. And they'd stand out there Sunday at 1 o'clock and say, we're here from the Civilian Conservation Corps, we're going to build a camp 1 mile out of town. Anybody that wants to come to work for us, we're going to pay you, and I can't remember the number, but let's say we're going to pay you $5 a week, okay? And for that $5, you must send $4 home to your family, and you will live on that camp. We will give you your clothing and your food and your health care and even some education. We'll teach you things like photography or drafting or reading and math. And on the weekdays, we're going to go out and we're going to clear land or build parks or clear roads. But you'll be making money. You'll be sending the money back to your family. You'll be productive. You can hold your head up high. And it was a fantastic program. They did a lot of neat things. Juniper Springs down in Ocala National Forest. If you ever go down there, look at the sandbags around the spring where you stand to jump in the spring. There's a plaque built by the CCC, 1934.
I say a lot of like state parks were built.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's Alino State Park is near here on Keystone, no, way up the road towards High Springs. They've got a museum to the Triple C. And you can see these pictures of all these guys with their uniforms and ties on. They look like they're in the military. And this is in the 30s. And guess what happened to the CCC? They were militarily disciplined. They stood in formation. They got up in the morning. They learned how to present themselves. They learned how to march. And when we started gearing up for World War II, those were our first soldiers. They were ready for it. So this is part of what Roosevelt does to address this huge societal problem of we got to put these people back to work. Good idea, bad idea.
In order to start mobilizing a little bit more of the depression with the country, do we have like some kind of data or historical writings of how much, if we got some loans from other countries to get the country back up? Or
I don't recall significant loans from other countries. We basically loaned it to our country. They sold bonds. Yeah.
So we didn't have that idea of let's get into debt, to get out of it.
Well, we got into debt, but it was debt that we owed our citizens, not debt that we owed other countries. Yeah. And we'll do more in this class about debt. Good idea, bad idea. But what I want to try to do as we go along is incorporate some of the history behind the theory that we're studying, the experiences we went through, what we learned from it. Okay? Anything else? Wednesday's last shot before the exam, right? So anything you got questions on, bring it to me Wednesday. I'll see you then. Bye.
The exam is open from Thursday to Monday.
Thursday through Monday, yes. Weekends in the library.